Welcome back to the podcast. This is the Indie Podcast where I bring on indie creators and indie publishers. First time guest, Nick Keating Casbarro. Close enough? Okay.
You got it.
Nick, as a first time guest, I always like to know a person's origin story. So, what got you into comic books and made you a lifelong fan?
Funny enough, when I was a kid, I used to draw my own comic books. I hadn't really gotten much into comic books myself. I know that sounds strange, so I'm having I guess a second renaissance now that I'm actually producing comic books. I'm buying a lot more comic books. I'm seeing a lot more of what's out there, whether it's sports, whether it's art, whatever it is. I've always enjoyed doing it more than I have enjoyed, I guess, consuming it myself. So I definitely want to see what's out there. I enjoyed making these because it was my first step toward bringing a pictorial version of what I'm writing about in the novel series to life. It was my first kind of step into another medium of entertainment.
All right. Tell the fans a little bit about yourself.
Okay, so I'm originally from Rhode Island. I went to school up in Boston to be a physical therapist, and turns out that wasn't what I wanted to do. So I ended up graduating early and getting into medical device sales. And I had always enjoyed the creative writing. It had just been put on the back burner for a very long time. And at the last company I was at, I was on a plane 3 to 5 days a week. And that's a lot of plane time. And so eventually you run out of things to watch on Netflix. And I started writing again. And so that is where it stemmed from. But yeah, I've been a sci-fi fan my whole life. So it made sense for me to go that route. I started with the Star Wars original trilogy on VHS when I was a kid. And from there, I graduated into other things. I started reading a little bit more sci-fi. The first real hard sci-fi I read was Dune. And I read that when I was about 13. It was my father's copy. And I should probably have it framed at this point. It's been flipped through a fair few number of times. And yeah, no, just I like sci-fi in all forms. I enjoy now sci-fi comic books. I've really been getting into that a bit. I enjoy sci-fi video games. I feel like that's an amazing medium of storytelling because it involves people in the decision making and the story itself. And eventually, I would like to see Vitalerium get into basically all mediums of entertainment within the next 10 years. So I'm beginning to make baby steps toward producing a version of Vitalerium in each.
So you're a novelist and a comic book writer. How did you decide to go down that route of all things?
Yeah, so the comic books were I to get the book out there and to start building a grassroots fan base. I started going to Comic Cons, first some local ones, now some bigger ones. Like I'll be at MegaCon this year in Orlando, which is one of the big ones. I think they had 175,000 attendees last year. And I started seeing all of these different comic books and authors who maybe had a comic book. It was a way for me to say not everyone is going to read a 600-page book. And that's just book one of seven that I have planned. So maybe that might not be the best way for some people to consume it. And so I started considering what if I branched out into other mediums? And this was the first one that I landed on because it made sense. It was a way for me to bring a visual pictorial version of what I'm writing about to life. And I could do it with a relatively small team.
Nick, is it true that you wrote your first novel pretty much flying around on a plane as that medical device specialist traveling around that country?
So the vast majority of the book, I'd say at least 80, 90% was written on a plane. That kind of became my writing office. As I was, after the first time I started, it was a particularly long flight from Miami to Hawaii. And I took a look at myself and said, all right, let's do something a little more constructive. And that's where this stemmed from. I got off the plane in Maui and I was finishing up chapter four because it had been so long since I had done anything like that. And from that moment on, I basically promised myself, I said, okay, you're on a plane every single week. Why don't we just make that your writing time definitively. So anytime you're on a plane, I don't care how tired I am, I don't care how good a day I had, how bad a day I had, I'm going to write. I don't care how many drinks I've had at the airport bar, I'm going to get some stuff done. That's where it all came from. Yeah. So a lot of the planning and the storyboarding that I did happened on the ground. I'd say at my home office when I had my full desktop and the ability to look things up and do some research. But the story itself was written at 36,000 feet.
So what made you to expand your novel into a comic book format, Nick?
I'd like to see this in all mediums of entertainment. I'd like to see this as an anime down the line, as a live action series, as a video game. I want to take this all the way. And comic books seemed a fun way for me to get in better touch with the fandom community and really just create something. It gave me an opportunity to really hone in on some of the more aesthetic parts of the story and flesh those out a little bit. And I'd say to this point, we're still only about 85% of the way there. There are definitely some things that, as I begin to refine the aesthetic of this universe and this kind of period in time in humanity's future, I'd say we're going to go a little bit more gothic, a little bit more like neo gothic industrial, and a little bit more metal inspired. You know, I'm a big metalhead. I listened to a lot of metal music while I was writing this book. It's a dark story. It's not your cozy fireside romance. I want the visuals to be able to reflect that as well.
So how did you find your artists and the colors? Because the coloring is actually unique. And how much collaboration between you and your other creative crew is there between you?
No, there's a ton of collaborations. I found my illustrator. His name's Francisco Nilo, and he lives in Argentina. He's
Does English?
talented. Yes, he does.
No, because I asked because there's
Yes.
some people who they don't speak at all the English stuff, and I'm like, how do you make your? We just make it. I don't know how we do, but yeah.
When I first started, I thought the timeline was going to be a lot shorter. I anticipated a shorter timeline to getting these created. And now I'm well aware of how intricate and how much time goes into making just a just a panel format to be able to get the story organized and vibrant and attractive to the reader. I was introduced to him through a friend of a friend who had actually started a pay-per-click comic book website at one point. And I just went to him and I was diving into this head first, and I didn't even really understand the industry or what it requires to make a comic book. And I said, all right, well, I'm going to seek some mentors. So he pointed me in the direction of Francisco. He said, you got to check this guy out. He's incredibly talented, not just with the artwork itself, but with his organization of it. And so I reached out to him. We had probably 3 meetings. I loved I loved his vision for it. I loved his artwork. And when he said, I really like sci-fi, I want to do sci-fi, I was like, hey, you're my guy. Because that's the way I feel about this type of content in general. I'm a sci-fi fan. That's why I wrote science fiction. And he's the one who introduced me to Chandran Panusamy, who's out of India. And he's my colorist, and he is also, like you said, similarly talented. He really adds that kind of finishing touch that really solidifies the tone of this type of story. Like I mentioned, it is dark, it's dystopian, and it's not a necessarily pretty future.
No, go on.
Our collaboration in general is pretty constant throughout the process of making these. Most of it is by email and by text. Sometimes we have a meeting where we sit down and, talk over Zoom. We're in different countries, so it's not like I can meet them at the coffee shop. But there's a lot of back and forth required to get it right. But at this point, I feel like they really understand what I'm going for. So some of the scenes, it's like they pull it out of my head.
So well, tell about a little bit about the world building, why you have it set so far in the future, which is like 6 centuries, and a little bit about the character Roman Matthews. How's that all connect together in your head?
In my mind, when I started writing the story itself, so the novel version, I've always had the desire to hop on a spacefaring vessel and explore the cosmos, be able to go to different planets and see what entirely different living situations are like. And part of it stemmed from that desire, and part of me wanted to stay true to the science portion of science fiction. And so I wanted to allow for enough time for humanity to reach a multi-planetary civilization where we have enough of a population to cover 7 planets. And Vitalerium itself allowed for, I guess, the maintenance of a semi-modern human civilization, although it is very different, semi-modern in terms of the way we interact and the way that we live our lives, but in a far future society. And then as far as Roman Matthews is concerned, Roman is my outlet for a lot of different things. He is an outlet to show how brutal that future can be, because he's essentially, they call him freelancer, but he is essentially a mercenary. He's a gun for hire doing odd jobs for local gangs so that he can drown out his trauma in liquor. And he's a lost soul for sure. And part of it is also a conversation about rediscovery of purpose through circumstances that he's thrust into in the story. And you only begin to uncover that in the comics, but in one of the next ones that comes out, you're really going to see why he is such an important character and why he's so different, and B, why he is such an important cog in all of the events that are to come. Because you're essentially in Vitalerium, you're following the gritty beginnings and the violent history that ends up producing one of the most important people in future history. And you get to see it every brutal step along the way, because history is bloody. And I wanted to create almost like a future mythological hero that isn't just the comprised of the songs that are sung afterward. I wanted to show the gritty truth of it all as it was happening step by step.
So, is there an actual endpoint to this, or do you have it going on quite far in the future?
I know how the story ends because I know the philosophical themes that the story is based on. That was one of the first things that I defined in my storyboarding. I know some of the major events that occur and a lot of the characters that will appear in future books. Book 2 actually comes out this year, and I'll have probably another string of 2 to 3 comics come out this year. How we get to some of those major events that are oftentimes outside of the character's control, that's anyone's guess. I try and keep the writing fluid like that so that I can write true to the characters and, I guess, foster a little bit of an organic character growth throughout.
So, do you have any other plans outside of this series when you get done? Do you have other things percolating?
I know my writing style, and I know I don't know about quite so dark. I have thought of a few ideas for more of a comical type of sci-fi, more of like your Douglas Adams and Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy feel, with maybe a little bit of a dystopian twist. So Hitchhiker's Guide meets Spaceballs. So you end up getting to see how goofy the dystopian leaders are. And I haven't fleshed that one out entirely yet, but I have been putting some thought into that lately. The other thing I have fleshed out a bit more is a character offshoot series from Vitalerium. So one of the characters that you meet in the book, his name's and in the comic book as well, is a character by the name of Modus Magni. And Modus Magni is the leader of the Wibitani militia, which is essentially it's a militia that operates under the guise of a number of different legitimate businesses, mostly in nightlife, in freelance jobs that are done for oftentimes shady or even sometimes high-powered characters in the universe. And when I started writing his backstory, because I So one of the other characters that I really wanted to dive into was Modus Magni, who you meet in both the book and the comic book. He's a pretty important character. And he's the leader of the Wibitani militia. The Wibitani militia is basically a gang. They're gun runners, operate a number of illicit businesses under the guise of some legitimate businesses, mostly in the nightlife sector. And it's a gang that Roman used to actually be a part of. He was one of the only people that's ever been allowed to leave the gang. But when I was writing Modus's backstory, and I write a backstory for every single character that has a speaking role in the book, no matter whether it's 3 lines or 15 chapters out of the book. I make sure that I define where they've been so that I can clearly see what their motives are and how they would speak, how they would act in any given circumstance or scenario. So when I started writing his backstory, I knew right away, I was like, I've got something here. This is something else that I really want to flesh out at some point. And I've already begun to start doing that in storyboard form, where I talk about how Modus came from Earth originally and ended up on planet Diorum, where Vitalerium takes place, and how he starts the Wibitani militia.
So, what advice would you give people that are thinking about starting their own self-publishing venture?
Dive right in. I would say find your mentors. It's always important to at least have a high level understanding of what the market is, what the process is like. Talk to someone who's done it before. Find them. I can't tell you how many people I've met at these conventions, illustrators, comic book producers, writers, who are just very free and open with that type of information because that's how you learn. As the person who's teaching it to you, that's how you solidify things in your own mind as to certain processes that you may have. And once you find that, just be unafraid to look like a fool at first so that eventually you can look like a pro. I can't tell you, everything is fixable, no matter how screwed up it may be in its first form. I've written and rewritten chapters half a dozen times. Sometimes in the editing process, I've had to go back to the drawing board with how I want certain parts of a comic book to look or to be portrayed, because I went and talked with my illustrator and he was like, that's going to be tough to make that work. Although I will say, for the most part, they have been able to overcome any challenge that I've given them. They are very open to trying new things and figuring out unique ways to get certain elements of the story and bring them to life.
Nick, before
So
we
yeah,
just
just learn as
go on,
yeah, I was gonna say just learn as you go, be unafraid, fail fast and pivot, and you can do the same thing.
Nick, you get the last word. Any closing thoughts before we wrap this up about your comic book, Vitalerium?
My whole goal is to create the best content possible right now. My goal isn't to make a ton of money. I really just want to expand this universe and make it accessible to as many people as possible. So if you pick up a copy, I sincerely hope you enjoy. And every copy you get gets me that much closer to making the movie. So I
Nick,
appreciate you.
thank you very much for joining me on the podcast today. Hope to have you back on again. Thanks so much.
Thank you.